Hello, and welcome to People of the Pod, brought to you by American Jewish Committee. Each week, we take you beyond the headlines to help you understand what they all mean for America, Israel, and the Jewish people. I'm your host, Manya Brashear Pashman. This week, my colleague Julie Fishman-Raymond, AJC's Managing Director of Policy and Political Affairs, spoke to Ron Campius, the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief of JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. They broke down the latest in the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Julie, the mic is yours.
Ron, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so pleased to have this conversation with you because we get to flip the tables. And someone who's really a beloved and renowned journalist in the Jewish space. And finally, I get to ask you questions. So thank you for making this opportunity available to us.
Thank you.
I want to start by talking a little bit about the conventions. You were in Milwaukee covering AJC's events alongside a number of other things. Thank you for being there with us. What were your biggest takeaways from the Republican convention, particularly as they related to the issues of Israel and anti-Semitism?
I think Israel was front and center, and they made it front and center because it's an obvious advantage that they have over the Democrats right now. I think the representative moment was in a way when Matt Brooks, the CEO of the Republican Jewish Coalition, he was invited for the first time to address the Republican convention. And the first thing he said was, let's hear it for Israel or something like that, or let's hear it for the hostages. And there were cheers. And then he says that couldn't happen in a month at the Democratic convention. And he might be right. And so that was a big plus for them. On anti-Semitism, it's a little more opaque, but it's problematic, I think, because after Matt spoke, he called us Jewish media reporters together for a little gaggle. And we asked him naturally about the isolationism that the vice presidential or the running mate pick, J.D. Vance, represents. And it's interesting the way that Matt put it. He said, yeah, it is a problem. He was candid. He said, it's a problem in the party and we plan to fight it. And, nobody prompted him, but he said, we plan to take on the Tucker Carlson wing of the party. The interesting thing about that is that he said, prevent Tucker Carlson wing from getting a foothold. And Tucker Carlson had very much a foothold at the convention. He spoke on the last night setting up Donald Trump's speech. He was up in the balcony with Donald Trump. And of course, Matt's point is that Tucker Carlson is very much an isolationist, particularly as far as Ukraine goes, but he's given hints as far as Israel goes. But it's more than that. He's platformed anti-Semites, and he's kind of ventured into that territory himself. Anti-Semites like Candace Owens, Kanye West. And I think that is something that Jewish Republicans are going to have to grapple with.
One of the things that was discussed at AJC's event alongside the Republican National Convention was the policy positions of not just J.D. Vance, but others who sort of align with that faction of the Republican Party, I guess the Tucker Carlson faction, and sort of reading the tea leaves on Ukraine and saying, at what point does the hesitancy around support for Ukraine translate into hesitancy for support for Israel? And does it? What would you say to that question?
It's interesting that, at least as far as I could track, that played out in an explicit sense only at your event, at the AJC event. There were people who were asking hard questions of the panelists, and two of the panelists were very much not stumping for Trump. They were defending Trump and the Trump policies. Kristen Fontenrose, not so much. She was more critical, and even though she was part of the Trump NSC. And so the defense that they were saying is that simply, whatever you may think of Trump's position, this is, Rich Goldberg has particularly said this, but I think Ken Weinstein also said it. Whatever you may think of Trump's positions on Ukraine, the strength he will project in the world, and this was right after the assassination, and Rich Goldberg kept on bringing up that Associated Press photo of Trump looking very defiant after being shot. That strength is going to deter the kind of actions that Putin has taken in Ukraine. But the flip side of that actually came up a couple of weeks later at a Christians United for Israel conference here in D.C., where isolationism was very much on the mind. And what they were articulating, and what might have been articulated at an AIPAC conference, if AIPAC still had conferences, it doesn't. But what they're articulating is that it's holistic, that you can't just say, like J.D. Vance says, I'm all for assisting Israel, but we don't need to assist Ukraine because Russia's bad actions in Ukraine are being supported by Iran. Iran is supplying arms to Russia in Ukraine that it then can, see how those arms work in Ukraine, and they can use them theoretically against Israel. We're seeing now, as tensions build up in the Middle East, that Russia has Iran's back. And then, there's also China, which is also problematic and is buying Iranian oil and helping to prop up the Iranian economy that way. So it's not simply a matter of, whether one side projects strength better than the other side. I mean, this is the argument coming out of the Christians United for Israel thing. It's a matter of constant engagement and awareness of how all these things can interlock.
I think that's a really great point, and I'm glad you made that connection. I know one of the other issues that was present or discussed at the Christians United for Israel conference was the issue of the hostages. And what you said before about the sort of rallying result of Matt Brooks' comments about, let's hear it for Israel, let's hear it for the hostage families. And a similar cry might solicit or elicit at the DNC. What do you think we could expect? Would you expect that a hostage family will take to the stage as Orna and Rona Nutra did at the DNC? And if so, what might the result be?
So that's a good question. I know that they've asked. I know that the hostage families have asked to appear at the DNC. I know that there are people who've told me that the DNC, especially like with Kamala Harris, who has spoken out for the hostages, I don't see how Kamala Harris could not have the hostages or some sort of representation of the hostages at the conference. On the other hand, the Democrats are going to have to worry about, I don't think they're going to be booed, but I think that they're not going to get the same sort of enthusiastic reception that they got at the Republican conference. And simultaneously, the uncommitted movement, the movement was founded in Michigan and spread to some other states, that when Biden was the nominee, particularly, they were upset that Biden wasn't doing enough to stop the war in Gaza, wasn't doing enough to force Israel into a ceasefire, and they wanted to show that they didn't necessarily have to vote for him in November, so they didn't vote for him in the primaries. And they had different effects in different states, but certainly in states like Michigan and Minnesota, I think that they had a pretty good turnout as far as that goes. And they want a doctor from Gaza to speak at the DNC. So, which might be fine. It might be a legitimate enterprise on their part, but that the Democrats are going to be accused of both sidesing it, that the Republicans wouldn't have somebody like that. So because of the Democrats of different constituencies, as much as the Republicans are now, at least the Trump campaign is now trying to reach out to Arab Americans, it's much more a constituency for the Democrats, as are the Jews. It's going to be like a tightrope for them to walk. And so I don't know how that's going to play out, but it's certainly something we're going to be tracking.
Talking about that tightrope, and also because you mentioned Michigan and Minnesota, let's talk for a moment about the selection of Minnesota Governor Tim Walz for the vice presidential nominee. He has both spoken at Apex conferences, stood by Israel after the October 7th attacks, talked about Jewish students on campus dealing with encampments and anti-Israel protest, and has really been outspoken about rising anti-Semitism in this country. On the flip side, he also speaks to the more progressive flank of the Democratic Party and has urged the party to do more intentional kind of outreach to anti-Israel voters who aren't committed to voting the Harris-Walz ticket. What do you make of him in this moment as both a campaigner and then presumably, if elected, what would you make of him as a vice president?
It's hard to say right now. Nobody was really aware of Tim Walz a lot outside of Minnesota until last week. But it's so funny because, there was this whole pushback against Shapiro from the far left because he was perceived as being, I'm talking about Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor, who was a front runner, because he was perceived as being too pro-Israel. But Yair Rosenberg did a really good job. I also did a little bit of reporting into this about how the other candidates, other likelies that Kamala Harris were considering are also pro-Israel. And Tim Walz has a long list of accomplishments. But, a measure of how fast this summer has gone, how crazy this political season has been, is just a week and a half ago when Yair put up his story. He didn't even have Tim Walz in it. He was looking at Roy Cooper. He was looking at Mark Kelly from Arizona. And then, because nobody was even thinking about Tim Walz then. And now he's the running mate. But from what you can see about him, and like JTA just did a big story about his master's thesis on Holocaust education. He's somebody who really wants to listen. His recommendation to the Republican Party, he's coined this whole weird thing. That's actually why the Harris campaign noticed him, because he was the first to call the Republicans weird. The Republican candidates, but he said, don't direct that at the voters, direct that only at the nominees, because we have to listen to the voters. And so I think that you can look at what he says about listening to the protesters on campuses in that context. For somebody who was born in Nebraska and lived most of his life in a town of 400 people in Minnesota, He shows like remarkably nuanced understanding of things that are of Jewish concern regarding the Holocaust. He's talked about how, one can look at the Holocaust legitimately as an anomaly in history, but also understand it as something that could be repeated, which is actually Yehuda Bauer, the famous Holocaust historian's point. The way he boiled it down was that the Holocaust happened only to the Jews, but it can happen to anybody. And so that's Waltz's outlook, and it shows somebody who's really sort of read up on this and considered it in depth.
Because you mentioned that Josh Shapiro had been very much in the running there, I want to get your take on the sort of social media trends of calling him Genocide Josh because of his pro-Israel statements and record. Is that just blatant anti-Semitism that we need to be mindful of? Was it specific? Do you think it's just, savvy opposition researchers? What do you make of that?
We often think of anti-Semitism as, planning to be anti-Semitic and putting out a statement. There are people who are consciously anti-Semitic. But the much greater and the much more vexing problem is that how it just seeps into the discourse. We have a polarized society, and it's just very easy when you're opposing somebody to grab whatever is in the toolbox to harm them. And for anybody who's Jewish, you see this, and we talk about it openly. You see it when we talk about women in politics, about how attacks on them can be gendered. And nobody, at least nobody on the left complains about that. Actually, maybe they did a little bit. The Bernie bros made gendered attacks on Hillary Clinton, and they didn't deny it. But anyways, so you can say that attacks can be gendered, but it's hard to explain how attacks can also be anti-Semitic, because that's a tool in the box. And then a lot of people on the left don't want to acknowledge that they slip into that. And I think that's what happened with Josh Shapiro. I think that there is, for some reason, I can speculate as to, or not even speculate, people have said why, even though he was just as pro-Israel as Tim Walz, he's not less pro-Israel, but Mark Kelly did things that I'm sure Josh Shapiro wouldn't have done. Josh Shapiro doesn't like Benjamin Netanyahu. Mark Kelly, the senator from Arizona, went to Netanyahu's speech, shook his hand afterwards and applauded, and they didn't get attacked in the same way. And if you look at some of the reasons that Shapiro was attacked, they talked about his upbringing, his going to a Jewish day school in the Philly area, and the things that he was exposed to. They talk about his going to Israel when he was a teenager. And those are things that are part and parcel of a lot of American Jewish upbringings. And so you can say those things are indicting, but there's a point, because you're an American Jew coming up in American Jewish communities, going to be exposed to a lot of pro-Israel. But at what point does that become anti-Semitic? Because that's just the natural part of Jewish life.
I want to ask you another question related to the media. I want to sort of get your take. Last week, AJC and the Jewish Federations of North America published an open letter to media outlets generally, really identifying how so many of them got the Hezbollah attack on the soccer field in the Golan so wrong. That after a dozen Druze kids playing soccer were murdered in the middle of the afternoon, Washington Post, Houston Chronicle, others just totally misrepresented the facts. The Washington Post headlined a story, Hezbollah denies responsibility for the fatal rocket strike. It wasn't true. Hezbollah celebrated the attack until they learned that children were killed and then walked it back. And then doubling down, a later Washington Post story showed an image of the funeral of one of the children who was killed. But the headline read, Israel hits target in Lebanon. So if you only look at the picture and you only read the headline, you think it's a Lebanese kid that has been killed by a strike in Israel, not that an Israeli Druze kid was killed by a Hezbollah attack. CNN, the AP, they all sort of downplayed Hezbollah's role in these really horrific murders. Is this ignorance? Is it bias? Is it both? And regardless, if we're sort of operating under this principle of journalist integrity, is this okay?
No, it's not okay. I don't know what went on at the Washington Post. I was witness kind of to one of the most foundational episodes in bad media takes. It happened right after the Second Intifada began, and the AP put out a photo of a policeman helping up a Haredi Jewish kid who had just been knocked down or even beaten by Palestinian rioters in Jerusalem. And the AP captioned the photo saying that the policeman was attacking a Palestinian on the Temple Mount, which is so funny because there's a gas station in the back of the picture and there's no gas stations on the Temple Mount. I mean, if you know Jerusalem, you know the Temple Mount, you know how crazy that is. And so what had happened was that I knew the guy who was handling photo editing at the AP that night when he got this picture. And at the time, this is in the early days of the internet and computers, the picture came across at the AP's Israeli photo agency affiliate, and Hebrew couldn't work on that machine. So like the Hebrew was scrambled. They captioned it in Hebrew, it was scrambled. So the guy calls up the other guy who's also tired, and he said, is this like some cop beating up a Palestinian on the Temple Mount? He said, yeah, sure. And that's how the thing goes out. So it's just like journalists can screw up in ways that speak to a certain underlying bias about the conflict. They expect to see certain things, but it's also can be stupidity and laziness and just screw ups at the last minute. I mean, I imagine that's what happened with the Washington Post front page, but it's awful and it needs to be remedied and people need to be more educated and they need to pay more attention. I think you're right. I think in a way the media has been treating the Hezbollah-Israel conflict in the north in a way differently than it treated, at least at the beginning, it treated Israel Hamas. Hamas is clearly defined as a terrorist organization. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. Hezbollah is an organization that's holding Lebanon hostage. Historically, people now think it was a big mistake to invade Lebanon in 1982. Hezbollah was partly an outgrowth of resentment of the Israeli occupation in southern Lebanon. But Israel withdrew to UN. They went to the UN and they said, you decide where the lines are. We're not going to decide where the lines are. You decide where the lines are, and we will withdraw that to that point in 2000. Israel did that. Hezbollah continued to attack. Hezbollah launched a war in 2006 that Israel did not want. And conflict with Israel helps uphold Hezbollah within Lebanon. And so I think that because Hezbollah is a very proficient and weathered militia, they fought a war in Syria. They fought a terrible genocidal war in Syria. They were on the wrong side of that. But they fought a war in Syria. They're good at what they're doing. So maybe there's a reflex to see this as a conflict between two militaries, but it's not. It's a conflict between Israel and a terrorist organization that unprovoked launched missiles inside Israel on October the 8th, even before Israel was striking back in Gaza, as a means of solidarity with Hamas. And so I think that needs to be front, just as I think a lot of media, obviously JTA, but even a lot of non-Jewish media, always put out there that Hamas started this war. It needs to be reminded that Hezbollah also started its version of the war. And at Hezbollah, it's not an army that's accountable to any kind of civilian infrastructure, never mind a democratic one like the Israeli army is accountable to elected officials. It's its own militia with a stranglehold on Lebanon. So yeah, I think that should be evident in everything that's written about that conflict. And then maybe that's what helped distort at least the initial reporting from what happened in Majd al-Shams, which is just horrible.
One of the things that AJC is always trying to call on media outlets to do is to know who to call, right? If there's an incident related to Israel that they don't fully understand, if there's an anti-Semitic attack and they need more context, to understand that there are Jewish individuals and organizations who can help to provide insight and texture and understanding so that their reporting can be more accurate. That's one of the recommendations in our call to action against anti-Semitism in America, our recommendations for media. I wonder if, journalist to journalist, if folks call you and say, Ron, this is what we're writing. Is this right? Knowing that you are just such a font of knowledge. They should. This is what I'm saying. They should call you.
My son asks me, very occasionally I do get calls, more having to do with my alleged knowledge of the American Jewish community and how it works and how it functions. I get calls about that. I think on Israel, less so because everybody's an expert. Everybody considers themselves an expert. Everybody flies in. I think what was an unfortunate standard, this is it was at the AP 20 years ago, there was an unfortunate, it wasn't just the AP, it was all mainstream media, that you get your best takes from a foreign correspondent between 3 and 6 months into the assignment, because it takes them 3 months to learn it, but it takes them 6 months to go native, which is to sort of really understand the nuances. I think that's unfortunate because I think going native, really understanding the nuances, sort of delving into a story, becoming familiar with it, becoming sympathetic in ways with all sides to the story actually enriches a story. And I think that that's something that maybe, I've been doing JTA for 21 years. I've been in journalism for 35 years. I think it's great to have fresh outlooks. It's good. I think it's also good to sometimes rely on institutional knowledge and to listen to people who have been here before. It was weird at AP. I was in a position at AP when I wasn't allowed to use my institute for bizarre reasons, institutional knowledge. But it was funny because at the outset of the Iraq War, the major Iraq War in 2002, 2003, I knew things that signaled that it was going to go wrong. because I'd lived in the Middle East. And I wasn't the only one, by far. There were a lot of people who knew those things institutionally. It means literally saying like what the Israelis said in 1982, the Shiites are throwing rice. And you had actual examples in 1982 of Shiites throwing rice at Israelis, and in 2003 of Shiites throwing rice at Americans. They want this, and it never works out that way. It goes awry, but nobody was listening because people were too invested in a particular outcome to listen to the institutionalists. And I think that that's a problem. There's a reflex sometimes to say, oh, the institutionalists got it wrong in the past because the world is still a mess. But that's not their value, the value of the institutionalists. And a great institutionalist just passed away, Martin Indyk. The value of the institutionalists is that sometimes they can actually say, this is where I went wrong, and this is what we misunderstood, and this is how we misunderstood it, and this is how we were deep in the weeds and we misunderstood it. And that's the kind of knowledge that I think shouldn't go wasted.
Thanks so much for that perspective. I was going to ask you, as a final question, if there was anything that you wanted to raise that we haven't discussed yet. But I would also add to that question, feel free to answer that question, or is there something that we're getting wrong now, institutionally?
Yeah, I think that, there's a lot that we're getting wrong now institutionally. I think that people are, on every side of the Israel-Hamas conflict, they're retreating into sort of easy, reflexive understandings of what could go right and what could go wrong. I think that there is a value in understanding how toxic Hamas's ideology is. That was, I think, grasped at the beginning after October the 7th, but has slipped away as this seems to be just a conflict. And people are retreating into Israel's bashing Gaza. We have to get it to stop bashing Gaza, which is fine. It's an outlook. It's a legitimate outlook, but it's one that's not going to register at all with any Israeli unless you take into account how Hamas is perceived among Israelis as a genocidal organization. If it wasn't before October 7th, it is now. On the other hand, I think that sort of reflexive, we can never have a two-state solution. I'm not saying advocating for a two-state solution. We can never have a two-state solution. We're just going to go on as we've gone with the Palestinians. I think that also reflects this kind of like a reflexive blindness that you have to account for the Palestinians somehow. Nothing's going to be imposed on them. They have to be agents and actors in whatever happens, and it might not happen in my generation, it might not happen in my lifetime, but that has to be back of mind. And I think for a lot of people, particularly in parts of the Israeli establishment, it is not back of mind. So those are things that I think that people can maybe, if these competing, they're not actually enemies. I'm talking about people who are on the same side. They can be on the same side in Israel. They can be on the same side in America. But they're rivals and they don't like to listen to each other. But if they did talk to each other and listen to each other, maybe they would find nuances that could get everybody to a better place.
If we could do a word cloud of some of the themes that have come out of this conversation, listening is definitely one of the words that would be prominent. And I think it's not only a good aspiration, but I also want to highlight that our listening to you on these really important issues is revelatory, truthfully. And we're grateful for all the work that you're doing with JTA every day, but also for being here on People of the Pod with us and for all the wisdom that you've shared. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you missed last week's episode, tune in for my conversation with AJC Jerusalem Director Avital Leibovich on what the widely reported deaths of 2 terror leaders last week could mean for Israel and the wider region. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by AJC. Our producer is Atara Lakritz. Our sound engineer is TK Broderick. You can subscribe to People of the Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or learn more at ajc.org/peopleofthepod. The views and opinions of our guests don't necessarily reflect the positions of AJC. We'd love to hear your views and opinions or your questions. You can reach us at peopleofthepod@ajc.org. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to tell your friends, tag us on social media with #PeopleOfThePod, and hop on to Apple Podcasts to rate us and write a review to help more listeners find us. Tune in next week for another episode of People of the Pod.